Well, hey, everybody, this is Robert, and welcome to today's show. Now, we hear of people in the press, the politicians, college professors, and the chattering political class uh, claim that this is constitutional, this is unconstitutional, while they continually promote an increase in the size and the power of the federal government. Is what they say and write in line with the Constitution and the intent of the framers? Well, joining me today to take a look at the Constitution is Mike Maharrey. Mike is the National Communications Director for the 10th Amendment Center and the managing editor of Shift Gold website. He's also the author of several books, including Constitution Owner's Manual, The Real Constitution Politicians Don't Want You to Know About. Mike Maharrey, welcome to the show, sir.
Hey, Robert, thanks so much for having me on. I really appreciate it.
I appreciate it too. Very interesting topic, a very important topic. Let's go ahead and start out with just a summary to get things started. What's the purpose of the Constitution? What were the founders' goals and their vision? And what makes it different? And this, I know this is a very heavy question, a lot of things. What makes it different from what other countries have done throughout history?
Yeah, that's a great question. So there's a number of layers to unpack. I think the simple answer is, what was the point of the Constitution? What was the purpose? Well, ultimately, it was to create a union of separate political societies. When the colonists won the Revolutionary War, each state was recognized essentially as its own country. If you look at the Treaty of Paris, where the British accepted where the war was concluded, you'll actually see that the British called them 13 sovereign states. And when they said states, they meant the same thing as nations. So Virginia had the same status on the international scale as France or any other country. So then they were united under the Articles of Confederation. And the purpose of the Constitution was to create, as they put it, a more perfect union. But still, I think it's important for people to understand that essentially the states have never lost that character of being sovereign political societies. The states are actually the fundamental building block of the United States system of government. A lot of people are really confused by that. They think that it's one nation, because obviously we say that, in school every day for 12 years of our lives when we say the Pledge of Allegiance. And then, of course, after that, the United States was never intended to be one nation. It is a union of states. So the Constitution created that union, and it created a central government that was intended to handle a very small number of things that the people at that time felt it would be better to handle as a union. So primarily war, peace, foreign relations, foreign trade. I think James Madison really summed up the purpose of the Constitution perfectly, or the type of system that it was creating in Federalist Number 45. He said that the Constitution, he called it the proposed Constitution at the time because it hadn't been ratified yet, but he said the Constitution delegates to the federal government powers that are few and defined. And then remaining with the states and the people were powers that are numerous and indefinite. And he went on and he specified that the powers that would primarily be exercised by this federal government would be war, peace, and foreign relations. And all of the things that pertain to the life, liberty, and property of the people would remain with the states and the people. So we have a federalist system, not a national system. And I think that's where a lot of people today really go off the rails, because we're conditioned to think that everything, comes from the center. Everything evolves from Washington, D.C., and the states are basically little counties that do the bidding of the federal government. That was never the intention at all. So the founders created this union. It was a federated republic. That was not unheard of. What was unique about the Constitution at the time is the fact that it was written. And this was a big deal in the colonial mind, even before the revolution was concluded. Their experience was that the British government had this, what we would call today, a living, breathing constitution. The British Empire did have a constitution, but it was not written down anywhere. It was kind of built on tradition. It was considered to be all of the laws that were passed and all of the court precedents and all of the legal opinions, and all of that created this this unwritten constitution. Well, the colonists found out real quick that when you have an unwritten constitution, the rules can be changed in the middle of the game. And that's essentially what the British government did. And that was the complaint of the colonists in the 1760s and moving into the Revolutionary War, that essentially the British government was changing the rules, that they were violating things that had been long-standing constitutional principles, but they didn't have anything to turn to. So they thought, you know what, if we write this down, we'll be good. And so even before the U.S. Constitution, this idea that constitutions should be written and that they should be set by the people and they should only be changeable by the people and that the government shouldn't be able to willy-nilly add to its powers. That was really the huge change that we got with the American system. Unfortunately, we've abandoned that and we've gone back to the British model that's effectively a living, breathing constitution. And we're seeing the results today. We're seeing as you mentioned in your intro, we're seeing this constant evolution of more power going to the central government, where now the whole thing has been flipped on its head. Instead of having powers few and defined, the federal government has powers numerous and indefinite, and the state's powers have been relegated to few and defined. And I would argue that that is not a good system. The country is far too large to be governed by a few people in Washington, D.C. We were warned of what would happen with consolidation, as the founding generation called it. Patrick Henry said that it would lead to total tyranny. And I would argue that we're not far from that today, insofar as the federal government basically does what it wants. So that's the broad answer to your question, I think.
Yeah, a really good answer. And actually, that Madison quote is key for the different questions I'm going to be asking you about. Let's now, so much of the Constitution is either ignored or interpreted incorrectly out of a lack of knowledge or purposely to achieve some political ends. Probably a lot of the latter.
Yes.
Yeah. Let's take a look at some of the more misunderstood parts and the interpretation of some versus what the framers were intending at the time.
Right.
And the first one I want to look at is what they call the General Welfare Clause.
Oh, yes. One of my favorites.
And just the name of it just opens up all kinds of trouble.
Right.
So it's Article 1, Section 8, Clause 1. And let me see, I got the right quote here. The Congress shall have the power to lay and collect taxes, duties, imposts, excises, to pay the debts and provide for the common defense and the general welfare of the United States. So, Mike, how badly has this clause been horribly interpreted so that basically Congress can do whatever it wants?
Yeah.
What is the meaning of the clause and what was it meant and what happened to it today?
Yeah, I would call this one of the top 3 most abused clauses in the Constitution. Let me kind of back up a second, though, and mention something that I think is important for context as we kind of move forward talking about some of these various clauses. Some people might ask, well, who cares what a bunch of guys 200 and some years ago said about the Constitution? We live in a modern world, and the Constitution needs to change with the times. This is the argument you get for the idea of a living, breathing Constitution. And I would argue that, and I'm not the only one, obviously, Madison argued this, many, many years ago, that you cannot have a stable system of government when the meaning of the Constitution can change with, the evolution of vocabulary or the changing of words. You have to have some set standard in order to understand what the Constitution means, in order to have any kind of stable governance whatsoever. And ultimately, from a legal standpoint, the Constitution is essentially a contract. It's a contract between the people of the various states that entered into this union. And when you have a contract, the contract has a meaning. You can't have a contract without a meaning. And I use this example sometimes to kind of give people an idea. Imagine if the bank came along and said, you know what, Robert, you have a living, breathing mortgage. And in 10 years, all of a sudden they say, we don't really like that you have a 3% interest. So we're going to jack that up a point. And by the way, you're going to make 2 payments a month instead of 1. Well, you wouldn't accept that. I mean, that's absurd, right? But they would argue, well, this really means this, and this word is changed to that. And so we're going to just reinterpret this as we go along. Nobody would do business under a contractual law system that worked in that way. And yet that's exactly what we've created with the way the Constitution is being interpreted. So there has to be a set standard. So what is that? Well, both Madison and Thomas Jefferson and many others argued that what you look at is you look at the intent of the ratifiers. Those were the people who accepted the Constitution on behalf of the people. They were all elected. So every state had a convention. The delegates to that convention were elected by the people as representatives. And they're the ones that determined whether or not the states were going to sign on to this contract, whether or not they were going to ratify the Constitution. So the arguments that they made in support of the Constitution reveal the understanding, because that's what it was accepted on. That was the basis of the contract. So if you and I are entering into a contract and we have this written down, and you say to me, "Hey, Mike, what does this clause mean?" And I say, "Well, this clause means X, Y, and Z." Well, that really dictates the meaning. You can't go 300 years from now and say, "Well, this word now means something else," and we're not going to look at it that way. It doesn't work that way. So you have to have that stable constitutional interpretation, and that comes from the founders. So I think that's really important before we even look at these various clauses.
Yeah, let me interrupt real quick, Mike. That kind of goes back to an article I read by you recently, that you did an article all on point of reference, right?
Right.
Yeah, this is the exact same thing. If you can talk about the point of reference real quick, and though you kind of already did, but
yeah. Well, I actually ran across this quote by Jefferson. And it's interesting because I get this pushback a lot whenever I talk about constitutional interpretation and what people say, "Well, Mike, you're just an absolutist." Well, yeah, just like I am with my mortgage. I'm very much an absolutist when it comes to the Constitution. And I ran across this quote by Thomas Jefferson, and he basically said, a written constitution, I'm paraphrasing here, obviously, but he said a written constitution obviously can be violated by the government at any time. But that doesn't make it useless, because it provides us a frame of reference that we can point people back to and call the government back to its proper bounds. So when we see it stray outside of these bounds, we can rally and we can say, no, you're not doing this. And then it also fixes our principles, is how he put it. So we have these principles that the United States was built upon. The Constitution fixed those principles in writing. It goes back to this whole idea of a written Constitution. The founding generation would be mortified at what we have today, because it's exactly what they fought a bloody revolution to get out of. So yeah, it's a fixed point of reference. It gives us a place to call people back to it. And it also sets those principles in writing. And when we abandon those principles, again, we cannot have a stable system of government, because the government is always going to try to grow. There's a lust for power. I have a theory. Most politicians are sociopaths. And so if they're not restrained by anything, they're going to grow their power. And sadly, we live in a culture today where so many people, as you mentioned, for their own political agendas, they're willing to give the government power because it's going to do something good. And I say that anytime you give the government a power to do something good, ultimately that power is going to be turned against you, because at some point, somebody you don't like is going to have control of that power. I don't understand why people haven't learned this lesson. The left for 8 years, cheerled Barack Obama with his pen and his phone, doing his executive orders and circumventing Congress. And then all of a sudden, when Trump had that power, they were horrified. Oh my gosh, we're going to be Nazis. And the problem wasn't really Trump.
So
the
true.
problem is the power that was handed to him. And now we have the flip-flop. We had a lot of people, unfortunately, in the Trump years that were perfectly happy for, Donald Trump to violate the Constitution and do things that were outside of the scope of power. And now they're mad that Biden's doing the same thing. So that's why we need this set standard and this power, because the politicians, again, I think they're mostly sociopaths, no matter whether they're Democrats or Republicans or something in between. So, yeah, I think I probably went off the tracks a little bit.
No, you're good. So let's go ahead and jump back on the general welfare clause.
Right. So again, it's very important. There's several ways of reading the Constitution, and of course you have the kind of liberal left view, which is it means whatever we want it to mean. And then you have various more conservative ways of looking at the Constitution. And one of those is what is known as textualism. And that's the idea that you can just read the words on the paper and understand it. And to some degree, that's true. I mean, I think it is important to take the words at face value, but we also have to understand two things. Number one, words change with time. I imagine we'll probably get into the Commerce Clause. It's a perfect example of word meaning changing over time. Mm-hmm. And then we also have to understand that the Constitution is a legal document. So it does help greatly to have some understanding of contractual law in the 18th century, because this is what the Constitution was based on. And with the General Welfare Clause, this is very important, because if you look at what you read at face value, it does appear that the federal government, Congress, can tax and spend money for anything that constitutes the general welfare. Well, what is that? Well, I mean, I could, you twist things enough, you can argue that anything is in the general welfare. So it creates this expansive power that really has no limits whatsoever. And again, James Madison, in one of the Federalist Papers, I don't remember which one off the top of my head, but he warned about this, and he flat out said that if you take this term, general welfare, to mean anything and everything for the general welfare, well, then you have essentially an unlimited government. And nobody at that point in time wanted an unlimited central government. So when you look at the General Welfare Clause, it's very important to not stop at that General Welfare Clause, but to look at the enumerated powers that follow. So you'll see a list of however many powers there are. The power to the post office, the power to raise armies, all of those things that follow. Legal law, no, that's not the right way to say it. Legal construction tells you that if you have a general statement followed by a list of things, that list of things limits the general statement. So yes, the federal government has the power to tax for the general welfare, but it can only tax for the general welfare within the limits of the powers that are followed and listed afterwards. Otherwise, why list the powers? I mean, if you're going to say general welfare, then why would you spend all the time? They were writing with a quill pen. It wasn't easy. Why would you spend all the time to write out those very specific things that Congress could do if you meant anything and everything? So rules of construction tell you that this idea that the general welfare will let you do anything is a fallacy. And again, when you look at what the ratifiers said, what the supporters of the Constitution said, they were all talking about a limited central authority. Well, you don't have a limited central authority if the General Welfare Clause means anything and everything. So it really makes no logical sense.
Yeah, as far as the enumerated powers, I think there's 17 or 18. So it is quite limited, right?
Yeah. And I've heard people say, if you actually look at the powers of the federal government, if you take those that are enumerated in Article 1, Section 8, and then the various other powers that are scattered throughout the Constitution, depending on how you count, you'll get somewhere around 24 powers, between 20 and 30 specific powers that the federal government has. That's it. Obviously much different than what we have today, where the federal government tells you what kind of light bulbs you could screw in your fixtures and how much water you can flush down your toilet.
Boy, turning over in their graves, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Let me go ahead and switch gears a little bit before I get into the next bastardized clause and talk about Article 2, the executive power. And my reading of it is the president actually has very, very limited power. He's the commander-in-chief of the army, appointing Supreme Court justices, a handful of other things. Nothing like we have today. Right. What are your thoughts, Mike?
Yeah, absolutely. And again, this was by design, and it's important to look at the situation that the American people were coming out of. They fought a revolution against a country that had a king that had expansive powers that were often abused, that were often viewed as tyrannical. And so there was a very strong mindset against placing too much power in the hands of any given individual. They wanted the most power to reside in Congress because they are the most responsible to the people. They're elected every 2 years. There's more of them. And so that's why the legislative authority is vested in Congress. The president is supposed to be the executive. That means he executes the laws that are passed by Congress. He doesn't write the laws. He doesn't interpret the laws. He looks at what Congress gives him and he executes those things and makes sure that they are enforced. Obviously, the laws are supposed to be within the confines of the Constitution. Today, we have basically the president makes the rules, and you can't just blame the presidents. A lot of this falls on the responsibility of Congress, because those guys, they like to pass the buck. So they write these really vague laws that essentially allow these executive bureaucracies, so all of your ABC agencies, your IRS, your OSHA, your FDA, DEA, they create these laws and they give these bureaucracies powers to effectively write the laws, make the rules. And that was absolutely would never have been tolerated in the founding generation, because again, they didn't want that power residing with people who don't have any type of accountability to the citizen or the voter. So yeah, the president. You really shouldn't even notice the president a whole lot, exactly. unless you're in a war, or he's given his State of the Union speech or something like that, or foreign relations and those types of things. Appointments. There are certain things that the president obviously can do, but the rule making and the law making. And I mean, I was reading this thing the other day, and they were talking about how Joe Biden has just screwed up the oil, and Donald Trump had gas prices low. As if, would you even want? I mean, that's not a thing, but if it was a thing, would you really want one person to be able to control the oil? I mean, it's the scary thing when you think about, especially when you look at the character of people who rise to presidency, in modern times. I can't think of any that I'm really impressed with in terms of their commitment to liberty or humanity in general.
So in your opinion, Washington was a good starting point, though, right? He refused to keep on getting reelected, and so he essentially had the right focus. I'm not talking about everything right. He did, but yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting. If you go back and spend a lot of time reading any of the early, the political thinkers of the 18th and 19th century. So, your Thomas Jeffersons, your James Madisons, Patrick Henry, John Adams, even some of the guys that I might not like, even, somebody like Alexander Hamilton, who I can't stand. These were obviously learned men. They thought deeply about political philosophy and liberty. I don't think we have. I can't picture Joe Biden reading a book on philosophy. I mean, maybe he did one time. I doubt he remembers it. But it is interesting that there was I feel like there was a much deeper philosophical bedrock in terms of governance than we have today. Now, that said, when they get in office, they all fell to the temptations of power. I mean, even the best of your presidents, Thomas Jefferson or Washington, with putting down the Whiskey Rebellion, or James Madison dragging us into the War of 1812. A lot of them talked a good game, but again, power is enticing. And when you have that power, it's very important. It's up to us, really. We have to restrain that quest for power. What was it? Lord Acton said, the power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. So it's very important to put checks on people, because even the best of them can be overcome by the temptations of power.
Okay, let's go ahead and jump into the next clause. Article 6, Clause 1. This Constitution and the laws of the United States, which shall be made in pursuant thereof, key point right there, and all treaties made and shall be made under the authority of the United States shall be the supreme law of the land. Anything in the Constitution or laws of any state to the contrary, notwithstanding. The Supremacy Clause. And again, another one that's hugely misunderstood. Mike, what are so many people getting wrong about the Supremacy Clause?
Well, if you ever read any kind of mainstream article that's dealing with some issue where they think that the state has overstepped its bounds. So anytime you start talking about, let's say, put it in a current event, you have states that are talking about resisting the vaccine mandates, not enforcing the vaccine mandates, and somebody go, oh, well, the Supremacy Clause. Whenever you see the Supremacy Clause quoted, and this is almost without exception, you will see it without those very important words that you emphasized, in pursuance thereof. They literally put an ellipsis there and leave that out. So most people think the Supremacy Clause says, the Constitution and any laws that Congress decides to make is the supreme law of the land. That's literally how most people think the Supremacy Clause. That in pursuance thereof is key. And all of the supporters of the Constitution, from Alexander Hamilton to James Madison to many of the important figures in the state ratifying conditions, they all said that if you have a law that is passed that is not in pursuance of the Constitution, that law is void. So just because Congress passes something doesn't make it the supreme law of the land. If it is not in pursuance of the Constitution, it is void. And when something is void legally, it is literally of no force. So that brings you into all kinds of questions of who decides, or, how do you enforce that? How do you push back against the federal government? Those are important questions. But the bottom line is the Supremacy Clause does not mean that whatever the federal government does is supreme. What it means is that if it's in the Constitution, if the power is listed, if you find it in those delegated powers and the federal government does it, then it is the supreme law of the land. Otherwise, it is not. So, when Congress raises an army, that is the supreme law of the land. That is in the Constitution. It is a proper role of the federal government. When Joe Biden writes something on, scribbles on a piece of paper and says we have a vaccine mandate, that is not the supreme law of the land, because it is not in pursuance of the Constitution.
Well said. All right. Well, so that kind of brings me to something that you fight for incessantly. That's the 10th Amendment,
right,
and states' rights. Mike, what is it and why is it worth protecting?
Well, okay, so you have two amendments that were tagged on to the end of the Bill of Rights, and actually initially they were a little farther up in the food chain, but they were considered to be very important. In fact, Thomas Jefferson called the 10th Amendment the cornerstone of the Constitution. And interestingly, neither the 9th or the 10th Amendment actually do anything. They don't change anything. They're what is known as a rule of construction. So they tell you how to read the document. And the 10th Amendment effectively says, I'm going to paraphrase here, but any power that is not delegated to the federal government. So as we've discussed, if you can't find it written in the Constitution, it was not delegated to the federal government, it remains with the states and the people. And this is really intuitive when you go back and understand the system as it was intended. When you understand that the states are the supreme political society in the American political system. And when we say states, we're not talking about, the land or the borders or even the state governments. We're talking about the people of the states. So really, when you see in the Constitution, it says we the people, and that tells you where the power is coming from. That was originally written, we the people of, and they listed all of the states. Well, they took all of the states out when they cleaned up the language because they realized some of these states might not ratify. So, but that's really what it meant. We the people of the states. So it follows that if the people of the states are delegating certain powers to the federal government, it stands to reason any power that was not delegated to the federal government remains where it was. And that's with the original political society, your states, or the people, as the 10th Amendment puts it. So it's very, very important to understand this. And it's really, again, it's implicit in the Constitution. The very fact that we have enumerated powers tells us that the federal government has a limited set of things it can do, and that the powers, it remains where it was. But the founding generation and almost all of the state ratifying conventions that called for amendments had something like the 10th Amendment in their list of things that they wanted to see changed as a condition of ratification. So this was deemed very important because they wanted it crystal clear, written in black and white, that if it's not listed, the federal government can't do it. And probably one of the most ignored clauses in the Constitution is the 10th Amendment. In fact, I've been told that they will tell you, if you're studying for the bar exam, that they'll tell you that if you have a multiple choice question and the 10th Amendment is listed as one of the answers, you should just automatically mark that off because the 10th Amendment is never the answer. That tells you just how far we've strayed from the original meaning of the Constitution, because in my view, the 10th Amendment should always be the first answer. And again, that was Thomas Jefferson's view. He said it's the cornerstone. It's the foundation of the Constitution, that this government is supposed to have limited power. So, and it's extremely important, and it tells you just how much power that the state governments actually have legitimately in this political system, and how, again, kind of goes back to the Supremacy Clause, how it's been abused. Because if you read the Supremacy Clause the way the most mainstream lawyers and media pundits and politicians read it, the 10th Amendment doesn't exist at all.
Right. And Mike, how does the 10th link up with the 9th? And I'll just go ahead and read that real quick. The enumeration in the Constitution of certain rights shall not be construed to deny or disparage others retained by the people.
Right. So,
as I said, that's probably a more forgotten amendment too.
Yeah, absolutely. And they go hand in glove, because again, we're going back to what is implicit in the Constitution itself, that the federal government has this limited body of power. And when they started talking about amendments, there was some fear that if you listed out these specific things that the federal government, can't do, can't violate your right to free speech, can't violate your right to keep and bear arms. They listed these 8 amendments that had very specific things in them. The fear was, well, people will construe that to mean that if it's not on this list in the Bill of Rights, then the federal government can do it, or the federal government can just walk all over it. So the 9th Amendment is effectively telling us that just because we didn't list something doesn't mean the federal government has the power to violate this right or trample on this right. And again, it goes back to what's implicit in the Constitution itself. It doesn't have the power to begin with. So, I tell people this all the time, and it boggles their mind. The federal government wouldn't have any power legitimately to regulate firearms, even if the Second Amendment didn't exist. Because if you go through Article 1, Section 8, you don't see any power to ban firearms or regulate firearms. Now, you could argue that maybe under the Commerce Clause, they could bar, firearms being sold across state lines or something like that. So that's why they have the Second Amendment, to make it absolutely clear. But by and large, if the power isn't listed, they shouldn't have it. So that's what the 9th Amendment is effectively telling us, that just because we listed these specific things that we saw as extremely important doesn't mean that there aren't other things that the federal government can't do that we're not going to put on the list.
Yeah. I guess I wanted to ask you, how is the Bill of Rights holding up with all the insanity that's going on? I mean, the 4th Amendment's been butchered by the Patriot Act, and now you see Biden wants to increase the IRS, the monies, monitoring your monies, and
right.
First Amendment's getting beat up. Second Amendment continually gets beat up. How are the Bill of Rights holding up?
Yeah, well, I think you answered your own question. I don't think they've held up very well at all. Yeah. And this is nothing new. I mean, we had in 1798, we had the Alien and Sedition Acts. And, if somebody wants to read something that seems pretty draconian, go read the Sedition Act, because effectively what it did was it made it illegal to criticize the president or Congress. Ironically, you could still criticize the vice president, because that was Thomas Jefferson. He wasn't the guy in power, and the party in power. But so this is nothing new. And it goes back to what I said before. When you have government power, I can guarantee you that politicians are going to find a way to abuse that power, because it's just the nature of things. And everybody understood that in the founding generation. They'd experienced it with the British monarchy and Parliament, and the hope was that a written constitution would somehow make these boundaries clear. And I think the boundaries are clear. I think where the failure is that we have failed to enforce the contract. Some people might be familiar with Lysander Spooner, who was a 19th century anarchist, and who famously said, whether it was intended to create this system or it just happened by accident, the Constitution is unfit to exist. And I always thought that that was kind of a dumb guy argument, because it assumes that somehow this document, I'm going to waive this paper and the government's going to stop doing something. No, it takes some enforcement action. And even James Madison wrote about this. He called constitutions parchment barriers. Obviously, a parchment barrier needs something behind it to enforce it. And that's where the power of the states come in. What should be happening is when the federal government violates terms of the Constitution, the states should be saying, we're not doing this. We're not going to assist you in this. We're not going to be complicit in this. We're not going to provide any support for this. And the dirty little secret is the federal government can't do squat without state and local cooperation. It lacks the personnel and the manpower. So almost everything it does happens because the states let it happen. The failure in the system has been us and refusing to really stand up when the federal government oversteps its bounds.
It's interesting that you brought up the Alien Sedition Acts. I remember going to a conference here in Tampa, and one of the speakers was Judge Napolitano.
Yeah.
And he used to preface a lot of his talks with that story about the Alien Sedition Acts. And if listeners want to check it out, I'm sure you can find it on YouTube, because he's done it quite a few times, but it's a really good and kind of a humorous story, the way he puts it.
I've heard him do that too. Yeah, he does that often when he speaks.
Yeah. All right. I got to pull out my notes to read the next clause. Article 1, Section 8, Clause 18, the necessary and proper clause.
Yes, the elastic clause, as it's called.
The elastic clause. And let me just read this for the audience. The Congress shall have power to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers and all other powers vested by this Constitution in the government of the United States or any department or officer thereof. Misinterpreted? Where are they getting it wrong?
Yeah, absolutely.
Probably being abused.
Yeah, absolutely. Interestingly, a necessary and proper clause was very common in contract law. Most contracts would have a necessary and proper clause. If you give somebody the power to do something, you would explicitly say you have the authority to do the things that are necessary and proper to put this into action. And that's really all it was. And so the reason it's in there is that because we have this idea of enumerated powers, and that all powers not delegated to the federal government, as in Articles of Confederation, they said explicitly delegated. There was fear that it would be so limiting that the government wouldn't be able to actually exercise the powers even that were delegated. So they put the necessary and proper clause in. The supporters of the Constitution blew it off as no big deal. It was standard legalese. It's absolutely just kind of self-evident that the government can do what it needs to do to put its powers into action. Now, interestingly, necessary and proper had a very widely understood meaning. And so those words necessary and proper are important. It had to be necessary to implement that power, and it has to be proper. Proper is very important. So the easiest way to understand it, I think, is to think about it in terms outside of government. Let's say that you and let's say I own a grocery store, and I'm going to enter into a contract with you, and you're going to be my manager of my grocery store. And I'm going to give you the power to run my grocery store in my absence. Now, obviously, I'm not going to list out everything that you can do in the course of running a grocery store. It would take forever. So I don't need to say you have the power to stock inventory, or to pay cashiers. Those things are necessary and proper to running a grocery store. But if you decide to just because you have the power of management, you decide that you're going to sell all of my groceries and buy a bunch of porno and turn my grocery store into a porn shop. Obviously, that would not be necessary nor proper for running a grocery store. So there is some wiggle room in the necessary and proper clause, but our good friend Alexander Hamilton basically took it and went during the national bank debate and turned it into something that went far beyond what was intended. And, a lot of the anti-federalists, those people that were opposed to ratifying the Constitution, warned that this clause would be abused because they would take necessary and proper to mean anything and everything. And again, clearly it can't. We have to go back to that Federalist 45. It's so important. The powers delegated to the federal government are few and defined. So when you start getting into this idea of implied powers, you very quickly get into quicksand because you can't have, you can't have powers that are qualified when you start talking about implied powers. So the necessary and proper clause, I think it's probably less abused today because most people can pretty much ram through whatever they want with general welfare or commerce. But certainly early on, the necessary and proper was a biggie. Again, Hamilton argued that it was necessary and proper to have a central bank in order to regulate commerce. And Jefferson and Madison and others argued very well that no, this is not necessary, nor is it proper.
So is it fair to do a critique of the framers and that, maybe some of the stuff in the Federalist Papers and all that should have been implemented into the Constitution itself, or they just didn't want to make the document that muddy and cluttered? I don't know. If you're able to abuse it by some of this wording, could have been done differently.
Yeah, I think it is absolutely fair to look back with a critical eye. Mm-hmm. My feeling, though, and this is just Mike's opinion, mm-hmm. No matter how specifically you made the language, people would figure out a way to worm around it.
Probably.
And we see this all the time. I mean, you see, if you have kids,
grown.
Okay, well, so you've raised kids, and
yes,
and so
sure.
you've experienced the logic and rationalization of a 10-year-old, right?
Yep.
So if they can twist words and sometimes you're like, God, that almost makes sense. So I really feel like no matter what, no matter how tightly they wrote it, at some point somebody would have figured out a way to worm their way around it or making it. Well, they didn't really mean this; they meant this, and because
right.
Again, that's the nature of political power, and that goes back to this whole idea of parchment barriers. There always has to be an enforcement mechanism behind any contract. You have to be able to say, no, this is beyond the grounds. This was not intended. And we're not going to let this happen. And that's, again, I think where the real failure is. And that's why I'm a little bit skeptical when people want to go back and have an Article 5 convention and we're going to get better amendments. And we can't get her to pay attention to the ones we have. I'm just not certain that we can tighten English language enough to really constrain politicians until we get to the point that we're willing to hold their feet to the fire and refuse to let them get away with it.
All right. The Commerce Clause. This is the fourth of the four.
Yeah.
It gives the federal government the power to regulate and control everything, basically.
Yes.
But what it actually says is to regulate commerce with foreign nations and among the several states and with the Indian tribes. Mm-hmm. Again, I know this is a redundant question, Mike, but what was the intent?
So I think this is a perfect example of where the changing definitions of words have taken us far afield from what was really intended. And the word here is commerce. And a constitutional scholar named Rob Nadelson has done really fantastic work. He's written a very long academic paper on the meaning of commerce in the 1700s. And when you look at the meaning of the word, it was much more limited than the way we understand it today. Today, when you hear the word commerce, we basically think any economic activity. And in fact, that is how the courts now interpret the Commerce Clause. And this is how you have a federal.
I'm guilty of it too.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's
Right.
and this is how you end up with a federal bureaucracy like OSHA that is regulating workplace safety, because that is part of economic activity. So that is under the Commerce Clause, and so now we have vaccine mandates. That's really the ultimate what you get to. Commerce really only meant trade. So it was the movement of goods across borders. So when you talk about international trade, you're talking about the movement of goods between various countries. When you talk about interstate commerce, that would be interstate trade, the movement of products across state lines. So it is quite an extensive power, probably one of the most extensive powers in the federal government's arsenal, but not nearly as powerful as it has been given today. So if you think about it, you have to go again. You have to look at, why did they do this? Why did they want to regulate interstate trade? And a lot of people will say, and I think they're correct, that the real reason was not to impede trade. It wasn't to, ban certain things or to keep things from moving across state lines. It was really to enhance trade. It was to ensure that Tennessee didn't put a tax on Kentucky whiskey, or some steel company in New York charges a tariff on South Carolina to bring in steel. That was the real purpose. You will hear some people argue that the real point was to make trade regular and to open up trade. Now, I'm going to take a little bit stronger position in favor of the federal government, believe it or not. I think it does, because if you look at the power of regulating commerce internationally, it's all held together. So I would argue that it does empower the federal government to regulate the movement of products across state lines. So the federal government could legitimately say, you can't sell raw milk in Mississippi that was made in Mississippi. You can't take it over and sell it in Alabama. But commerce, when you talk about trade, it clearly doesn't mean regulating workplace safety, wages, healthcare, all of these other things that have been lumped together in commerce. No. Movement of goods across state line, physical goods, all of this other stuff that you see that the federal government is doing in terms of commerce is outside of the realm of its power. And I think what has happened when you talk about, regulating any economic activity, well, again, as you pointed out, that turns into anything and everything. And I think the perfect example is the Supreme Court case that had to do with marijuana, Gonzalez versus Raich. He had this woman who grew 6 marijuana plants in her backyard in California, and the Supreme Court held that that constituted interstate commerce. Yeah. The only dissenting opinion was Clarence Thomas, who said, if you can regulate 6 plants in a woman's backyard, well, then you effectively have a government of unlimited power. And he's absolutely right. Mm-hmm. So again, the meaning of the word has been shifted. The Supreme Court has run with it. And now we have a situation where basically the federal government thinks it can run everything, including, what shot you get. Excuse me.
Well, thank you for these great explanations on these clauses. You mentioned vaccine mandates numerous times during our 48 minutes so far. Now, when I look at it, and you could tell me if I'm wrong. States do have police powers of sorts. So the states can, because if you look at vaccine mandates, all 50 states mandate vaccines, measles vaccine, right?
Right.
And it varies. They all 50 do polio, but then you go up to maybe you can't go to school in like 3 or 4 states without the HPV vaccine when you're a certain age.
Right.
But that is all the state. Where
absolutely
does the federal government have? They don't. They have no authority in this.
Exactly. I think you hit the nail on the head. And let me preface my comments by saying, just because the state can do something doesn't mean I think it should.
Correct. Correct.
I can make moral, ethical arguments against government mandating what you put in your body. But when you look at the structure, the legal structure of the system, the federal government has zero power. You can go all the way through. The only place you can maybe shoehorn it in is general welfare. And again, we've clarified that if you don't see it in the enumerated powers after general welfare, it's not part of the general welfare power. So you don't see anything relating to health, immunizations, disease control, or anything like that. But obviously, again, as you say, states have police powers. Now, you may be able to pull provisions out of state constitutions that would make that dubious. I can make that argument maybe in some states, but from the terms of the federal constitution, yes, the states have the power to do that. The states have a power to do a lot of things, and sometimes I have to remind people that, again, I'm not saying that I think the state should. I'm not even saying it was a good idea. I'm just saying this is how this system was created, where states have far more latitude in terms of what they do and the policies that they set than the federal government. So, with the economic shutdowns, I don't think it was a federal issue that the crazy governor in Michigan shut her state down. Again, we could look at the state constitution and argue that as governor, she probably didn't have that power, but it didn't have anything to do with the federal constitution or the Bill of Rights. And so what you end up with this, and this, I think, is the beauty of the system. It is a decentralized system. And I will argue that the most dangerous threat to our liberty is centralized power. That's why I want to decentralize as much as possible. That's why I'm such a big proponent of the Constitution. It's not because I have a Constitution fetish or because I think states are great. It's because I believe in decentralization. And we've seen the power of decentralization in the various responses to coronavirus. We're fortunate to live here in Florida, where it's been much less painful than, say, in Kentucky, where I moved from. And people have voted with their feet. I mean, people want to come to Florida anyway, but, you see people moving out of high tax states into lower tax states. You see them moving from high regulation states to lower regulation states. And that's the beauty of it. People can pick and choose and have some escape valve. When you have one size fits all government that is centralized in Washington, D.C., there's no escape from whatever tyranny is going to come down the pipe. So I like the idea of having 50 independent jurisdictions that are competing. And, you have as it was famously put by, I think it was a Supreme Court justice, I want to say it was Holmes, who said that, you have the laboratory of ideas, the 50 laboratories of ideas with the states. Mm-hmm. So that's really why I'm talking about this today. It's not because again, that I hold the Constitution up to be like the Bible or something, but it's because it is decentralizing. And I think decentralization is a path to liberty. It's more freedom. And, you want competition wherever you can have competition. And I make this analogy, if I was the king of the world and I was to say, you know what, I think Walmart is going to be the only place you can get groceries. Well, nobody would like that. Everybody would be like, Mike, that's a horrible idea. You're going to have higher prices and you're going to have bad customer service. You're going to have less selection. Well, that same argument applies to government as well. If you have one centralized government, you're going to have one size fits all solutions. You're going to have less choice. You're going to have higher prices, and you're going to have more inefficiency. And it's ironic that people on the left are so adamant against corporate monopolization, but they love monopolization of government. I think it's a horrible idea, and it doesn't work.
Yeah, and we're both in Florida, and I would just this is kind of off topic, but I would argue that this may be the freest place on the planet right now.
I've heard people make that argument, and
Right.
I can tell you, I don't think Kentucky was as draconian as other states, but we visited up there several times because a couple of our kids are still up there, and the difference is palpable. It's almost like you forget, and especially up here where I am, I'm in Northeast Florida, which is we call it Florida. I mean, I can get to Georgia in about 10 minutes.
Right.
And I mean, a lot of times I forget that there's even these mandates even exist. I mean, it's very rare that I have to put on a mask.
Right.
It's very rare that you hear anybody talking about it. But then you like go to other places. I went to Washington, D.C. to visit my daughter, and it was like, gee whiz,
Mhm.
you forget being in this situation. And so there again, it kind of emphasizes the importance for those of us who really care about liberty to really focus in on those people at the state level, because I think we have more control there. I think we can shift the paradigm better at the state level than we can at the federal level. And quite frankly, the states have a great deal of power. I've touched on this a couple of times. That's really what we do at the 10th Amendment Center. We want to use the power that the states have to break up the centralizing and consolidating impetus that we get from Washington, D.C. So I would, if I could encourage folks that are watching or listening to do one thing, it would be to shift your focus away from Washington, D.C. Quit obsessing so much over who's in the White House, because your policies aren't going to change a whole lot. And start focusing more on who is your state representative, who is your state senator, who is your governor, getting good people in position, even going down to the local level. Those positions are important. We can have much more influence, and we can gain a modicum of room for freedom to flourish. I don't think anything is going to be accomplished by electing, who the next most important election of our lifetime, whoever
Right.
that happens to be that gets elected. I will almost guarantee you that when their 4 years are up, the federal government will be bigger. It'll be more intrusive. It'll be in deeper debt, and it will probably be in another war to boot. So, I actually joke, and I'm not really joking, never call the 202 area code, which is where Washington, D.C.'s area code is. I have an exception because my daughter lives there, so I can call it, but only her number.
Hey, Mike, how do you respond to somebody that says, "Well, the Second Amendment, the framers didn't they didn't have ARs in mind, or a bazooka or whatever." I mean, how do you respond to somebody that says something like that?
Well, it's people think that that's a got you question, and I think the answer to it's very easy. What was the purpose of the Second Amendment? It wasn't so that I could go hunting. It wasn't so that I could, defend my house, although those are important things. The reason that we have the Second Amendment was so that the people would be able to check the power of the government. The founding generation they had these state militias. They were fearful of a standing army. They wanted the people to have the power to be able to face down the government if it overreached. And you can read people like George Mason wrote extensively on this subject, and he talked about the militia is not just this select body of troops. It is all of the, they said males, but basically everybody was considered to be the militia. This was a check against government tyranny. Obviously, if you're going to check government tyranny, you need to have the weaponry that the government has. So, if the government can have a machine gun, why can't I?
Okay.
That's my answer to the question. And
So are you
people,
making the
well, do
case?
you think he should have a nuclear bomb? Well, obviously, I don't think anybody should have a nuclear bomb, but I don't have a problem with civilians having military weapons, because that is the check. And then people will say, well, do you really think you're going to face down the U.S. government with an AR-15? Well,
I hear
ask
that
the
a lot. I
Vietnamese
hear
that
that a
question.
lot. Yep.
Yeah. Well, and again, ask the Vietnamese or the Afghanis. They held off the biggest military, most powerful military in the history of the world with AK-47s and homemade bombs. So, and I want to say I'm not advocating for violent revolution.
Oh, I know.
That's not. People will take that way. That's
Yeah.
not my thing. In fact, would border more on pacifism. I like civil disobedience that is peaceful in nature, but I think it is important. Gandhi actually talked about this. People look at Gandhi as being a pacifist, but he also believed that the people that you are being oppressed by need to believe that you have the power to do them harm in order for peaceful civil disobedience to work. So I think it's pretty handy for the average person to have some military style weapons. I think that maybe that does put a check. You wonder, would we look like Australia today if
Right.
we didn't have firearms? Would the government be more willing to lock us in our homes, or force mandates on us if they didn't know at some level? People might start shooting back.
The if you, not including the founders and all that, but if you go back the past 100 years or so, is there anybody that was in the White House that you could give props to, that they kind of tried?
John Taylor.
John Taylor.
I think he was probably he was he didn't serve for very long. First off, he was kind of a replacement, and basically what he was known for was vetoing things, and his own party hated him. That's why he wasn't reelected. He vetoed a lot of things based on constitutional principle. I think there are presidents that are less bad. I think most of them, if you judge them by constitutional standards, were pretty bad. I certainly wouldn't.
How about Coolidge?
Yeah, Coolidge was probably decent. He may have been one of the last, actually. If you get into the modern presidents, they were all pretty much garbage when it comes to the Constitution.
Yeah.
I'm not really an expert in presidents, to be honest with you.
I'm just curious.
If people that are interested, though, historian Brian McClanahan wrote a fantastic book. Yeah. I can't remember the number of presidents, but it was like the number of presidents that destroyed America and those that tried to save her. And he actually goes through and evaluates various presidents based on the oath of office to preserve and protect the Constitution. So,
yeah, there's a scholar at the Independent Institute. I think it's Ivan Eland. He's written a similar type of book, which is pretty decent.
Yeah.
Well, Mike, let's go ahead and close with this. I want to give you a chance to talk about the work of the 10th Amendment Center.
Yeah, I appreciate that. So I'm the National Communications Director. For folks who aren't familiar, you can get familiar pretty quick over at 10thamendmentcenter.com. It's all spelled out TENTH. The thing that I would point you to is what we call our State of the Nullification Movement report. And you can find it right on the very front page. And it's a free download. It's pretty long. I think it's about, I'm not sure. I think the new one, if it's not published yet, it's going to be published soon. I think it's in the neighborhood of 50 or 60 pages. And what it does, it actually goes through this whole idea of nullification, which I've alluded to. I don't think I've called it that yet, but it's the idea that states have the power and authority to block enforcement of federal acts. I was about to say laws, but they can be any federal act. And primarily the strategy is simply refusing to cooperate. And Madison gave this strategy in Federalist 46 because there was concern. There was a lot of concern during the ratification of the Constitution. How are you going to keep this limited government limited? And so Madison addresses this in Federalist 46, and he says that there are a number of things that people could do. He said the means of opposition are powerful and at hand. And then he lists out several things, things that we would typically think of as political activism. He talked about protests and kind of petitions. And I think the best one, though, the most important strategy he gave us was, and these are his exact words, a refusal to cooperate with officers of the Union. Just don't do it. I call it the Rosa Parks method. Just say no. Refuse to cooperate with what the federal government is doing. And when you do that, as I mentioned earlier, the federal government has a huge problem on its hand because it cannot possibly enforce its laws or implement its programs without the cooperation and assistance of state and local governments. Madison recognized this even back before the Constitution was ratified. He said if one state resisted, it would create barriers. He said if multiple states do it, he said it would create obstacles which the federal government would hardly be willing to encounter. So very important strategy. That's a lot of what we do at the 10th Amendment Center. We kind of have two rails that we operate on. One is education, doing what we're doing today, talking about the Constitution. What did it originally mean? What are its provisions? Kind of doing what Jefferson suggested and pointing people back to that standard, that point of reference. And then we do activism, and that's working with state legislatures and even local governments to come up with ways to withdraw support and cooperation with unconstitutional acts. And I mean, Madison didn't limit it even to unconstitutional acts. He said even things that are unpopular, the state and local governments can refuse to cooperate with. And the beauty of this strategy is that it is actually supported by the Supreme Court. I don't have much use for the Supreme Court in terms of, its fidelity to the Constitution. But in this case, they actually got this right. So we have a legal doctrine that is enshrined that is known as the anti-commandeering doctrine. And it is a crucial thing for people to understand. In a nutshell, and this is supported by at least 5 major Supreme Court cases, the federal government cannot force states to use their personnel or their resources to enforce a federal law or implement a federal program. This is supported by the Supreme Court. This is why Donald Trump was never able to do anything against the so-called immigration sanctuary cities, because the state and local government have the right to direct their resources as they see fit. I think the best example of the success of this is in the legalization of marijuana. That, we now have, I think, 36 states that have legalized in some way, shape, or form, whether it be medical or completely for recreational. Federal government still insists that we have absolute prohibition of marijuana. They can't enforce it. When the states quit, when half the team quits, you don't have much of a team left. So we can apply this strategy to virtually anything that the federal government does. Gun control. Federal government cannot enforce federal gun control without the cooperation of state and local enforcement. Just last legislative session, Missouri and Arizona passed laws that will effectively ban cooperation with a lot of the federal gun control. So this is a huge thorn in the federal government side. This is what we do strategy-wise. You can check it out over at the 10th Amendment Center. In my opinion, again, a little biased, but I think that in terms of actual activism, you're not going to get more bang for your buck anywhere out there. So please do take some time to check it out. If you're really interested in what we're doing, if you want to support us, you can do that. We have a membership program. There are certain advantages to being a member of the 10th Amendment Center, and you can do it for like as little as $2 a month. So I think that's a pretty good investment in a push toward liberty.
Yeah, good stuff. And I'll go ahead and link to the 10th Amendment Center in the show notes. And just it's funny that you brought up nullification, because that was something I wanted to discuss, but I think that's an interview all to its
absolutely.
Itself.
We can do a whole show on that for sure.
Yeah, so maybe we can take a look at that in the future. It's such a topic that so few people know anything about it, and I have to admit myself, I didn't know any. I was never taught anything in school or in college.
Yeah,
And
I will never forget.
I learned from Tom Wood's book.
Yeah, exactly. I'll tell you a story. So I started working for the 10th Amendment Center about 11 years ago. And, at that point, I was your pretty standard Republican. I had this vague sense that we had this 10th Amendment thing. And I was very much philosophically in line with the idea of limited government. Didn't really know what that meant necessarily, but that's kind of where I was. I mean, even at the age of 40. So I kind of got caught up in the Tea Party movement, like a lot of folks did, and wanted to get involved somewhere. So I get involved with the 10th Amendment Center. And the first thing that Michael Bolden, he's the founder and executive director of the 10th Amendment Center. First thing he did was give me a few things to read. And the first thing that he told me to read were the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions of 1798. They were penned by Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. If you have a few minutes, even if you don't have a few minutes, make a few minutes, Google the Kentucky resolutions of 1798 and the Virginia resolutions of 1798 and read them. I will never forget, I was sitting on my couch reading these. They're not that long. And I was like, how is it that I went all the way through high school? I took college level history courses. I've never heard of this. Mm-hmm. It blows my mind to this day. And then another thing was Tom Woods' book on nullification. And then I started, then you really go down the wormhole and you start reading ratification documents and you become a complete nerd. But it's something that most people aren't aware of, and yet is such a foundational part of America's political philosophy. And it's been basically dumped down the Orwellian memory hole. And it's very important for people to educate themselves. So take that time. Google Kentucky and Virginia resolutions of 1798. Pick up Tom Woods' book. It's called Nullification. I have a book that I've written that's called Our Last Hope, Rediscovering the Lost Path to Liberty. Can't remember the name of my own book. which is available over at the 10th Amendment Center or on Amazon. And that kind of goes through the philosophical, moral, and constitutional history of nullification. It's a very important thing for people to know, because this is the check. This is the power behind the parchment barriers that has been ignored for so long. And I really feel like that if we begin to apply that again, I don't necessarily think we're going to have liberty in our day, but we can certainly start to push back against the behemoth that we have growing in that swamp in Washington, D.C.
Yeah. We're on the same page for sure. All right, Mike Maharrey, thank you, sir, for all your knowledge that you imparted to us. I definitely appreciate it, sir.
Well, it was absolutely my pleasure, and I would love to come back at some point and talk a little bit more about nullification, or whatever you want to talk about. Obviously, I like to talk, so
Yeah, definitely will do. Have a good day, sir.
You do the same. Thank you.